Welcome to the Get Trauma Informed podcast, dedicated to unraveling the complexities of trauma, its pervasive impact, and the journey towards holistic recovery and realignment. If your radiance has ever felt muted, like I and thousands of others, you're in the right place to reignite your inner light. I'm your host, Wellness Coach Liz Blanding, and this is the Get Trauma Informed podcast. On today's episode of Mini Trauma Recovery Talks, we are going to explore the various forms of trauma. And as we are touring with our book, The Pathway to Trauma Recovery, the subject of or the awareness of various traumas have come up in conversation. And so I just wanted to take time out to explore and just explain what the different forms of trauma is. And one of the consensus that I'm getting across the board is that oftentimes we're faced with trauma and don't even understand that that's what it is. So if you're not aware that that is an issue, then how can you address it or overcome, right? You just think that that's how life is and you go on and go on and go on. But understanding these various forms can help us to shed more light on our topic of get trauma informed. So we're going to talk about physical trauma being one of the forms of trauma. And as I break down what each form is, and this is not exclusive to this list because there are various forms of trauma, and there are many different ways in which trauma affects each person. So we're going to get into a little bit of a description of as to what each trauma is or what it means, and then later on we'll break each one down specifically in its own mini trauma recovery talk episode. Okay. So when I talk about physical trauma, that is an injury resulting from accidents, violence, or physical abuse. It can be a chronic health condition or an illness that impacts the body. So now we have a physical trauma or physical injury. Okay. Emotional or psychological trauma that can stem from abuse, emotional, verbal, psychological, right? There is even financial abuse, right? Witnessing or experiencing violence, including domestic violence, bullying or harassment, betrayal or broken trust. Those all can trigger emotional or physical trauma. Sexual trauma, sexual abuse or assault, rape or non-consensual sexual acts, sexual harassment and exploitation, right? Okay, now there is developmental trauma. Some of these were, as I'm bringing these out, oftentimes people are really amazed that, wait, I identify with that. And that's why the Pathway to Trauma Recovery book is so important, because everybody, with over 70% of the population have gone through some type or faced some type of trauma, then that means that each and every one of us have been touched by trauma, whether it is by someone that we know or by our own experience. So hence our Get Trauma Informed movement. So let's talk about developmental trauma. Developmental trauma can stem from adverse childhood experiences that disrupt healthy development. In my chapter, which is chapter 1 of Pathway to Trauma Recovery, I talk about Erik Erikson's developmental stages, right? And how our developmental stages of birth and going up to about 9 to 12 years old, how our environment and everything that happens to us impacts us, and it impacts us for the rest of our lives. So if trauma hits in those stages, it can knock things all off balance. And I talk about that in chapter 1. So we're talking about developmental trauma, right? Chronic exposure to family dysfunction, substance abuse, or mental illness. That also is developmental trauma. And childhood neglect or abandonment, right, are all forms of developmental trauma. Now we're talking complex trauma, exposure to multiple traumatic events over an extended period of time. So that's where we get our complex PTSD, right? Often associated with chronic adversities in interpersonal relationships or family settings, right? And just to reiterate, I am a trauma recovery coach or trauma recovery practitioner, right? And I have certifications in areas of trauma, addiction, and abuse, along with my naturopathic certifications as well, just to reiterate that and clarify that. Okay, so let's go now to accidental trauma, involvement in or witnessing accidents, disasters, or natural calamities. Okay, surviving or being a victim of a traumatic event that was not intentional. So we talk about trauma not being our fault, however, recovery being our responsibility. But part of that responsibility is becoming aware that that trauma even exists. What about medical trauma? Traumatic experiences related to medical treatment, diagnosis, or hospitalization. That's also a trauma. Chronic illness or medical conditions that impact daily life. I want to stop there for a second, too, because oftentimes people say, don't use that trauma card. And what is failed to realize is that because of those statistics by the CDC, that 70 to 80% of the population have suffered trauma, with 8% of the population being it 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 reflects them as, or it takes on the appearance of the diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or complex PTSD. Okay, let's go into military or combat trauma. Again, a lot of our veterans came back with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And a lot of our vets didn't know they even had post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, we're talking about military and combat trauma, exposure to combat or war-related events, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, often associated with military services, okay? Collective or cultural trauma, traumatic events that impact an entire community or culture or society, right? Examples include wars, genocide, natural disasters, and systemic oppression. All of those are collective or cultural trauma. Interpersonal trauma, trauma experienced within relationships, such as a toxic relationship, betrayal, or emotional abuse. And oftentimes we don't even understand that we're in a toxic relationship and the impact that that relationship, whether it's domestic violence, and we talked about it just a bit ago, whether it's physical, emotional, psychological, does not matter. Those are all forms of trauma, and toxic relationships produce that result. Okay. Repeated exposure to dysfunctional family dynamics, right? It is essential to recognize the impact of trauma in highly, it's highly individual. And that's something, it tripped me up just a little bit, but it's highly individualized, because just as individual as our fingerprint is how our bodies react to that trauma experience. And the same event may affect different people in a uniquely different way. Additionally, trauma can be acute, right? Acute meaning that it's a result from a single incident, or chronic. And chronic means it's resulting from an ongoing stress or adversity. And that is very, very, very important that we understand the different forms and variations of trauma can so that we can address it, so that we can recover from it. So let's continue our list too. We're talking about systemic or institutional trauma, dreams, discrimination, racism, and prejudice that contribute to collective trauma within marginalized communities, right? Historical trauma stemming from the impact of systemic injustices or specific groups over time. I just want to share something too. We're on location for the one of the Pathway to Trauma Recovery book signings along our tour. So we're going to be popping up all over, right? I think this is amazing when you're in a project with authors from all over the world. We get to travel to those different areas and either support them or be a part of that book signing. And we get to possibly meet you in a book signing near you. So keep your eyes and ears open to the various locations, right? Okay, so let's go to humanitarian and refugee trauma. Trauma experienced by individuals forced to flee their homes due to war or natural disaster, even persecution. These all fall under humanitarian or refugee trauma. challenges related to displacement, resentment, and adapting to new cultures. Okay. Here's spiritual trauma. Ooh, this is a big one. This is a big one because there's so many people that are fleeing from churches because of being traumatized. And that's why I believe that it's so important that we get trauma informed so that we can stop re-traumatizing people and we can allow people to come to a church and have it be their home, their haven, their safe place. Because when somebody is experiencing trauma, they're always in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn trauma responses. And so, therefore, it's really hard for the brain to determine that this is a safe space. So, a church is supposed to be our safe space, right? But it's hard for the brain to determine that this is a safe space when we're in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode. And when we're in those modes, right? When we're in those modes, our brain is saying what? It's saying flight or it's saying freeze, right? And so, therefore, we want to make sure that we get the trauma informed movement out so that people can understand. Spiritual trauma is what we're talking about. Trauma related to religious or spiritual beliefs, experiences of spiritual abuse or manipulation. That's huge. Loss of faith or questioning one's spiritual identity due to a traumatic event. Okay. We're talking about next environmental trauma, trauma resulting from exposure to environmental disasters such as earthquakes, hurricanes, or wildfires. The impact of climate change can actually trigger your mental health, right, or cause you to go into some type of a anxious or anxietous position. Digital trauma, that's something new too for me to understand. Digital trauma. Digital trauma arises from negative experiences in the digital realm, such as online harassment, cyberbullying, or exposure to disrupting content. And that's why they have warnings and trigger warnings. And so you want to make sure that if you are very sensitive to certain information or you're sensitive to certain sites or sensitive to certain pictures or and such, that you make sure that you protect yourself. These are all the things that you want to do as you put together your self-care plan, okay? Psychological impact of constant connectivity and social media. That's also digital trauma. When you cannot be without your cell phone, and we have formed addictions to popping on to our cell phones and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. Now, what about financial trauma? Trauma related to financial stress, loss, or instability. That's also a form of trauma. Economic hardship, bankruptcy, or significant financial setback can cause a lot of trauma. Identity-based trauma, trauma associated with aspects of one's identity, such as gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, or disability, definitely can have an impact on how we see ourselves and on our self-esteem. Experiences of discrimination or prejudice based on our identity, right? Another form of trauma. And then lastly, we'll come up with, which the list is not all inclusive, but this educational trauma is also listed. Trauma occurring within educational settings such as bullying, and that is addressed in our book as well, academic pressure, or negative experiences with teachers, right? And it's very important that we not only become trauma informed and aware, but that we also understand it and can identify it in other people, especially people that have authority or rule over us. Okay, the impact of systemic issues in education on students' mental health. So it has an impact, a deep impact on the students' mental well-being. So understanding these diverse forms of trauma is crucial for developing effective strategies for support, intervention, and recovery. It is also important to recognize that individuals may experience multiple forms of trauma simultaneously, and a holistic approach to recovery often involves addressing various aspects of a person's life. So we're talking about the total well-being of a person, and understanding it and becoming trauma informed is our first step. I hope this information was helpful for you. I look forward to seeing you on our next or you listening to our next podcast. All righty. Talk to you later. Bye for now.
It's time to buckle up. No more suffering in silence. Our Power Pack journey to recovery and realignment starts now. Remember, you are collateral damage on someone else's warpath. Trauma is not your fault. Recovery, however, is your responsibility. I'm your host, Wellness Coach Liz Blanding, and this is the Get Trauma Informed podcast.